Welcome back to the channel. Tonight, I want you to settle in, maybe with a warm drink and a quiet room, because what you're about to hear isn't just another story. It's one of those disturbing truths buried deep beneath royal silk and centuries old. Stone walls, a story of power, control, and a mother's chilling decision that would change her son's life forever. This isn't a fairy tale about a prince lost in war or betrayed by an enemy. No, this is far more tragic because the enemy was someone he trusted more than anyone else, someone who was supposed to protect him, guide him, love him unconditionally. His own mother died in the ornate yet cold corridors of a European palace, hidden behind heavy drapes and guarded doors. A young boy's voice slowly faded into silence. He wasn't dead. But for the world, he might as well have been. The prince was very much alive, breathing, growing, aging alone. And this wasn't a decision made out of fear for his safety or concern for his mental health. This was a calculated, deliberate erasure of a life that once held promise, now locked away, forgotten. His name was Prince John, the youngest son of King George V and Queen Mary of the United Kingdom. Born in 1905 into the grandeur of the British monarchy, a symbol of continuity and national pride, Prince John was welcomed with joy. As the sixth child of the reigning royal couple, he was cradled beneath ceilings painted with angels and watched over by nannies dressed in crisp uniforms. His early years were filled with the expected rituals of royal childhood: formal portraits, carefully supervised play, and strict adherence to protocol. But something was different. As John grew, so did the whispers. He didn't behave quite like his siblings. He struggled to focus. His moods would shift unpredictably, and by the time he was 4 or 5, those close to the family noticed he seemed off. Back then, the world didn't understand neurodivergence or epilepsy the way we do now. Medical knowledge was limited, compassion even more so. In a world where the crown's reputation mattered more than human vulnerability, the idea of an imperfect royal child was unacceptable. John began suffering from increasingly severe seizures. His condition worsened, and though doctors attempted to treat him with what little they knew, the truth was clear: he would never grow into the kind of prince the monarchy needed. He was unpredictable, sometimes incoherent, often overwhelmed by large crowds and loud noises. He didn't fit the mold, and the mold refused to bend, and so the walls began to close in. First, his appearances in public diminished. Then came the letters and correspondence from palace staff, quietly expressing concern about his behavior. One aide noted how John would be unsuitable for future public life. Another, more bluntly, questioned whether he should even be seen by guests. It was all happening in slow motion. The royal machinery, polished and polite, began to erase him, one event, one photograph, 1 year at a time. His mother, Queen Mary, was known for her stoic demeanor. She was elegant, restrained, and above all, obsessed with duty. In many portraits, her eyes seemed distant, her expression unreadable. But beneath that composure was a woman who had already buried one child and was unwilling to watch another disrupt the carefully maintained image of the royal family. She convinced herself, and perhaps others, that removing John from public life was an act of mercy. That isolation would protect him from ridicule. That a quiet life in the countryside would be better for his fragile condition. But John didn't ask for isolation. He didn't choose exile. In 1916, when he was just 11 years old, John was sent away from the main royal residences to live at Wood Farm, a modest home on the edge of the Sandringham estate. It wasn't a royal palace. It wasn't even particularly grand. It was remote, quiet, and unassuming, perfect for hiding something or someone. The narrative the palace shared was gentle. That John was being given a calm environment for his health, that the stress of court life was too much for his nerves, that he needed peace. But the truth was far more brutal. This wasn't a summer retreat or a medical facility. It was a social coffin. Wood Farm became his world, his prison, his tomb of the living. He was assigned a governess and given minimal staff. Letters stopped arriving. Royal visits were rare, then non-existent. Even his own siblings barely saw him. For many of them, John became a fading memory, a name they no longer spoke aloud. The public, too, was kept in the dark. There were no official statements, no interviews, no updates. The monarchy didn't just hide John, they buried his existence inside. Wood Farm, time moved differently. The walls didn't echo with royal banquets or dignitaries' laughter. Instead, they held the quiet sobs of a boy slowly realizing he had been abandoned. He would gaze out of his window, watching the seasons change, the trees bloom and wither, and perhaps wondering why no one came to visit, why no one cared to say his name. But perhaps most haunting was how well the system worked. There were no leaks, no rebellion from within. The staff assigned to John were loyal to the institution, sworn to silence, and well aware of the consequences of defying royal orders. It was an efficient disappearance, one that required no violence, no scandal, just distance and silence. The psychological damage was irreversible. John's condition did not improve in isolation. In fact, it deteriorated. His seizures became more frequent, and his mental development stalled. And yet, no serious attempt was made to bring him back into the fold or even provide more comprehensive care. The family had already made their decision. The cost of deviation from perfection was erasure. By 1918, as the world celebrated the end of the Great War, as cities rejoiced and soldiers returned home, Prince John remained locked away, forgotten, an afterthought. A family secret whispered only in the quietest of moments. He was 13 now, still a child, yet burdened with a life few could imagine. On January 18, 1919, during one of his seizures, John collapsed and died alone. The staff at Wood Farm tried to resuscitate him, but it was too late. The boy who had once been a prince, who had been born into wealth and status, died in near complete solitude, with no parents by his side. The royal response was muted. There was no state funeral, no national mourning. Queen Mary reportedly wrote in her diary that it was a great relief, a sentence so cold, it still chills the bones. She justified it, believing that John had been a worry and a burden. She spoke of his death as a release for herself, and just like that, the last page of his short, tragic life was turned. But history has a way of clawing back what was hidden. Decades later, documents surfaced. Old photographs, quiet testimonies, and unearthed diary entries began to piece together the haunting truth that a boy born into one of the most powerful families in the world had been locked away not for his safety, but for the comfort of those who couldn't bear the sight of his imperfection. This wasn't an isolated case. It was a symptom of a larger disease and obsession with image, with control, with the illusion of perfection and Prince John became its quietest casualty. There's something haunting about a story that ends in silence. Not a dramatic fall from grace, not a scandal splashed across newspapers, but just silence. A child vanishing from public life without a trace, his name barely whispered even within palace walls, and yet, beneath that silence, a storm was always there, unseen, suppressed, but powerful. In the story of Prince John, that storm wasn't just within the boy, it raged in the walls that kept him away, in the hands that signed away his freedom, in the system that allowed a mother to disappear her son for the sake of royal image. By the time Prince John was locked away at Wood Farm, his fate had already been sealed, not by illness, but by reputation. The British monarchy in the early 20th century was more than just a family, it was a symbol, a political tool, a carefully curated exhibit of national pride. And symbols, by their very nature, cannot afford to be cracked. No part of the machine could malfunction without threatening the entire structure, and in the eyes of the monarchy, John was a malfunction. The royal family's fear of vulnerability wasn't unique, but it was especially ruthless. From Queen Victoria's obsession with moral discipline to Edward VII's double life riddled with secrets, every royal generation carried the weight of secrecy. But John was different. He couldn't be hidden behind a curtain of vague words or subtle denial. His condition was visible. His seizures were unpredictable. His behavior, at times, defied the rigid decorum expected of a prince. He couldn't be explained away, and that made him dangerous not in any literal sense, but symbolically. As a child, John had once played in the gardens of Buckingham Palace, laughing like any other child. His older siblings, especially Prince George, had fond memories of their little brother running through the hallways, giggling with a wooden sword in hand. But those moments grew scarce, and soon they stopped altogether. One by one, his siblings were told to focus on their studies, their royal duties, their appearances. John slowly became a shadow. Letters from George to his parents rarely mentioned him after 1914, and when they did, it was often brief, almost obligatory. Inside the walls of Wood Farm, life wasn't abusive in the way one might expect. He wasn't chained or starved. His caretakers were gentle, trained, and even affectionate. But love in isolation can turn into something else entirely, especially when that love is part of a system designed to erase. The staff may have smiled at him, played with him, read him stories, but they were also complicit in a larger act of abandonment. They kept him busy, entertained, and occupied, but they never questioned why a prince was living like a recluse, why his own mother hadn't visited him in months, why the world had forgotten him. Even Queen Mary's occasional visits became rituals of discomfort. According to archived letters and the memoirs of palace aides, the Queen would stop at Sandringham during winter holidays and sometimes visit John for a brief moment. She would sit with him, ask a few questions, and then quickly retreat. No warmth, no extended time, no lingering conversation. One aide later described these visits as dutiful, but not maternal, and in a chilling entry in her diary, Queen Mary once wrote that John looked well, but remains peculiar. That word peculiar became his label. It wasn't a diagnosis. It wasn't even a description, it was a dismissal. A way of making his complexity easier to ignore. And within royal circles, that dismissal spread like wildfire. Courtiers stopped asking about him, distant cousins forgot he existed. In official family portraits, John was never included. The sixth child of the king and queen had become an invisible prince, and the public, they never had a chance to truly know him. News of his illness was kept quiet, and by the time he had been exiled to Wood Farm, the world had turned its attention to bigger crises, namely, the First World War. Between the carnage of trench warfare and the collapse of European monarchies, the absence of one child from royal photographs went unnoticed. The press, loyal to the crown and under strict limitations, never asked questions. No one investigated why the prince had stopped attending events. No one wondered aloud why he was never seen again. But not everyone remained silent forever. Years later, fragments of John's life began to resurface, not from official royal archives, but from private memoirs, letters, and diaries of those who had known him. One particularly moving account came from Lala Bill, the devoted nanny who cared for John during his early years. Her letters reveal a boy who was affectionate, full of curiosity, and desperately in need of connection. She wrote of how he would wait at the window for visitors, his eyes lighting up at the sound of hooves approaching the gate. Of how he would struggle to understand why his siblings no longer came to play, how, even in his isolation, he remained hopeful. Lala was eventually dismissed when John's condition worsened. Another calculated move. The royal household didn't want emotional attachments clouding their judgment. They wanted control, and Lala's love for John was seen as a liability. She had grown too close, too vocal in her concern. Removing her wasn't just about staff. Restructuring it was about removing one of the last people who saw John as a child, not a problem. Behind the scenes, the monarchy continued to operate with mechanical precision. King George V was managing a crumbling empire, navigating the war and trying to preserve the monarchy's fragile image in a world rapidly losing faith in royalty. His journals barely mention John, not because he didn't care but because he didn't have the luxury to care. Or perhaps he had convinced himself that caring too much would be dangerous. Sentiment was weakness, and weakness had no place on the throne. But what does it say about a system that forces a father to forget his son? That teaches a mother to view her child's death as a relief? When John died in 1919, the public was finally informed, but only. In the briefest of statements, the official release mentioned his epilepsy and how he had died peacefully. It was the first time many even learned that the prince had been seriously ill. There was no national outpouring, no grand memorial. His funeral was quiet, attended by family members more out of obligation than grief. He was buried on the grounds of Sandringham, near the very home that had become his prison, and then, just like that, the page turned. The monarchy moved on, the war was over. The 1920s brought a new era of celebration and rebuilding. Prince John was left behind, tucked away in a forgotten grave, reduced to a footnote in royal history, but time, as it always does, began to pull at the threads. Decades later, historians and royal watchers began to ask questions. Who was Prince John? Why was he hidden? Why had the monarchy gone to such lengths to erase him? Books were written, documentaries aired, and slowly the world began to piece together the truth. Not just about John, but about the monarchy's obsession with perfection, about the countless others across different royal families who had been silenced, institutionalized, or erased simply because they didn't fit the narrative. John's story became a symbol, a cautionary tale. He wasn't the only one, but he was one of the most visible reminders of what happens when image is valued over humanity. His life, though short, forces us to question the systems we revere, the legacies we protect, and the costs we ignore. He was a boy who laughed, who cried, who loved trains and stories and simple joys. A boy who needed care, not exile, understanding, not avoidance. And though he died young, his story hidden for so long now refuses to stay buried. In part 3, we will uncover how Prince John's fate reflected deeper systemic issues within the royal institution, how other families across Europe mirrored similar tactics of concealment, and how this cruel pattern of abandonment wasn't an isolated tragedy, but a royal tradition. History often likes to preserve the powerful in clean, polished portraits. We remember kings and queens draped in jewels, not the darker truths they buried under silk and gold. But behind every carefully staged royal painting, behind every grand coronation, there's a long shadow, a trail of secrets that the world wasn't supposed to see. Prince John's story, as tragic as it is, isn't a solitary case. It's a reflection of something much bigger, something colder, something systemic. The truth is, John's erasure wasn't an unfortunate anomaly, it was the consequence of a long-standing royal doctrine that demanded flawlessness. In the eyes of monarchy, being royal meant being ideal, and if you weren't ideal, you weren't royal enough to be seen. To understand the true magnitude of Prince John's isolation, we have to step back and look at the royal mindset of the time. European monarchies had always valued image above reality. From the divine right of kings to the concept of bloodline purity, royalty was built on illusion. The illusion of strength, the illusion of control, the illusion of being chosen by God. Anything that threatened that illusion, even something as human as a child with a medical condition, was swiftly hidden. John's story wasn't just about epilepsy. It wasn't just about one boy. It was about a global royal pattern of concealment. Families from Russia to Germany, from Austria to Spain, followed the same silent protocol: remove the imperfect, hide the different, deny the real. Take the example of Alexander Romanov, the last empress of Russia. Her son, Alexei, suffered from hemophilia, a disease that caused his blood not to clot properly. It made even minor injuries life-threatening. But instead of facing the public with honesty, the Romanovs kept his illness a state secret. They brought in mystics like Rasputin to heal him, believing it would protect the monarchy's image. And when the Russian Empire fell, people were stunned to learn the truth: that their beloved Tsarevich had been gravely ill all along, that the empire had been crumbling under the weight of denial. Or look at the case of Prince Eric of Denmark. He was the son of Crown Prince Gustav VI Adolf of Sweden and Princess Margaret. Eric was born with severe intellectual disabilities, and by the time he was a toddler, it became apparent that he would never fulfill royal expectations. He was quietly removed from public life, sent away to live in isolation. His existence was rarely acknowledged, even in official biographies. His name was often omitted. Sound familiar? These weren't accidents. They were strategies. The royal world had rules, and those rules didn't leave room for vulnerability. Back in Britain, the story didn't end with Prince John. In the years that followed, the same cold logic was applied again. Perhaps the most harrowing parallel comes from Queen Elizabeth II's own cousins Nerissa and Catherine Bowes-Lyon. Born with developmental disabilities, these two women were placed in the Royal Earl's Wood Hospital for mentally disabled individuals, but rather than visiting them, rather than providing care, the royal family took a darker path. In public records, both women were listed as dead in the 1960s, even though they were very much alive. They remained locked away in an institution, out of sight and forgotten by their own family. It wasn't until the 1980s that journalists uncovered the truth, sparking public outrage and renewed scrutiny of royal practices. These stories form a grim pattern. Again and again, members of royalty who didn't fit the expected mold were cut off, abandoned, erased. Sometimes they were locked away, sometimes they were declared dead. Sometimes they simply vanished from family narratives. What united them? All was silence, and silence is powerful. It can make a tragedy feel clean. It can keep the public calm. But it also rots the truth. It eats away at empathy. And it leaves behind a legacy of unanswered questions. Why did these families choose secrecy over support? Why did mothers and fathers, kings and queens, allow their children to be erased? For Queen Mary, the justification seemed clear. Duty came first. The monarchy came before motherhood. She wasn't just a mother, she was the Queen of England. And that crown, cold and heavy as it was, didn't tolerate unpredictability. Her diaries and letters reveal a woman who believed in restraint, discipline, and order. A woman who believed that emotions were dangerous. Even after John's death, she wrote of him with detachment. He is at peace. She once noted, I miss him, but not in a way that distracts me. That wasn't callousness. Necessarily, it was survival. She had been raised to rule, not to grieve, but the tragedy is that in choosing monarchy over motherhood, she set a precedent that echoed, for generations, that it was acceptable to trade away a child for the crown. That appearances were worth more than people. John wasn't a political threat. He wasn't a rival. He was a child with epilepsy. But he represented something terrifying to the monarchy: imperfection. And in an institution built on control, even the smallest crack was treated like a structural collapse. So they did what they always did. They sealed it shut and told no one what lay behind it. There's another layer to this that makes it even more unsettling. As time passed and medicine evolved, the royal family had every opportunity to change course, to revisit these hidden tragedies, to make amends. But instead, they leaned harder into secrecy. Even in the modern era, admissions of past mistakes come only when public pressure becomes too great. Rarely do they volunteer the truth. It wasn't until 1998 that the grave of Prince John received a new headstone more than 75 years after his death, and even then, the gesture felt hollow, like a footnote in a long-forgotten story. For decades, his grave was marked only with a small wooden cross, weathered and worn, barely visible to visitors. No royal flowers, no dedicated monument, just silence, and yet John's legacy remains. Not because the monarchy preserved it, but because the world began to ask questions. Because journalists, historians, and even everyday people refused to let him disappear. They dug up letters, uncovered photographs, interviewed elderly staff, and pieced together the truth that royalty had buried. In recent years, there's been a slow but growing shift. More people are questioning royal traditions, exposing hidden histories, and demanding accountability. The image of the flawless royal family is cracking, replaced by a more honest, human portrait, and at the center of that shift is the story of a little boy who was never meant to be remembered, but we do remember him. We remember the boy who loved model trains. The boy who waited at the window for a visit that never came. The boy who smiled through confusion, who tried to make sense of a world that rejected him. We remember the prince who was never allowed to be a prince, and we remember what his story tells us, that power can erase people, but not forever. That even the deepest silence can one day be broken. The winter of 1919 was brutal, not just in weather but in the way it marked the quiet, unceremonious end of a life already erased long before the final breath. Wood Farm stood cold and still on the evening of January 18th, the wind pressing against the windows like a reminder of the world that lay beyond its walls. Inside, Prince John, only 13 years old, was tucked into bed, just like any other night. His caretaker, Charlotte Lalla Bill, the woman who had been more of a mother to him than the one who bore him, was nearby, as always watchful, loving, and quietly prepared for what might come. John had suffered countless seizures by then. Some were minor, barely noticeable, others were violent, terrifying to witness. His epilepsy had only worsened in recent months, and there was a growing understanding among his small circle of caregivers that time was running out. But in the royal family's world far removed from Wood Farm, that reality didn't carry the same weight. To them, John had already ceased to exist in any meaningful way. He was a silent page in their story, turned long before it was finished. That night, as a seizure overtook him, it was clear this one was different. It was longer, more intense. Lalla Bill did what she could, holding him, calming him, whispering soft words through trembling lips. But within minutes, it was over. Prince John was gone. Not with ceremony or farewell, not surrounded by family or comfort, but in the arms of a governess who loved him more than his title had ever allowed. The call went out to Sandringham House, where Queen Mary and King George V were staying. The news was received with the gravity reserved for an unfortunate formality. Queen Mary's diary recorded the moment with chilling simplicity. "Dear little Johnny died suddenly," she wrote. "A great shock, though for the poor little boy's restless soul, death came as a great relief." It was as though she had already rehearsed those words long before they were needed. No grief, no heartbreak, just a sense of release from the inconvenience, from the burden, from the potential scandal he had always represented. Prince John's funeral was held the next day, quiet, quick. His coffin was small, made of elm, carried through the frosty grounds to the nearby cemetery at St. Mary Magdalene Church. The royal family attended, his parents, his siblings, but there were no public displays of emotion. No nation stood still. No mourning crowds gathered. He was laid to rest. As quietly as he had lived and seen, the royal response was deliberate. There would be no national announcement beyond a brief statement. The press, still deferential to the monarchy in those days, printed simple, sanitized versions of the story: that Prince John had died of a seizure after a long illness, that he had been kept in peaceful seclusion for his health. There were no questions, no curiosity. The silence held, but while the monarchy turned the page, others did not. Lalla Bill never truly recovered from John's death. In letters to friends, she wrote of her heartbreak, of the loneliness that consumed Wood Farm after his passing. She stayed on the estate for some time, keeping his room intact, his toys neatly arranged, the little train set he loved still resting on the floor as if waiting for him to return. She spoke of his laughter, his moments of joy, the way he'd clap his hands during story time or mimic the whistle of a train engine. In her eyes, he wasn't a burden or a secret. He was a child, a real one, not perfect, but entirely deserving of love. Over the years, the story of Prince John faded from the public consciousness. His name was rarely mentioned in royal biographies. In official family trees, his presence was reduced to a line of dates. Born 1905, died 1919, no detail, no story, no identity. It wasn't until decades later, when more open records and retrospective journalism began peeling back the layers of royal history, that people started asking questions again. Who was the boy in the shadows? Why had no one known? Why had the family allowed him to be removed from view so completely? In the late 20th century, a slow trickle of information reignited the conversation. John's photographs began to appear in historical exhibits, smiling, clapping, dressed in white sailor suits, just like his brothers before him. But unlike them, his timeline was cut short. He had no legacy to inherit, no lineage to pass on, just fragments, letters, faded images, and silence. In 2003, the BBC released a dramatized film titled The Lost Prince, which told John's story with rare sensitivity. It brought his name back into the public conversation, portraying his life not as a medical case, but as a human tragedy. The film showed him not as the peculiar child so often described in palace correspondence, but as someone vibrant, imaginative, funny, and ultimately lost in a world that didn't know what to do with someone like him. It was the first time many people truly saw him, not the title, not the diagnosis, but the boy. And what his story revealed was a deeply uncomfortable truth, not just about one family, but about an institution that had long valued control over care, illusion over inclusion. The monarchy, built on centuries of power, had no place for someone who didn't fit the mold. And in their desperate need to maintain perfection, they committed one of the most profound betrayals a family can inflict. They abandoned their own. Even today, remnants of that thinking remain. In recent years, conversations around royal transparency, mental health, and inclusion have become louder. Prince Harry and Meghan Markle's public departure from royal duties, in part due to mental health pressures, reignited these debates. The institution that once locked Prince John away now finds itself constantly at war with its own image, a battle between preserving tradition and acknowledging the very real, very human people behind the titles. And that's the crux of John's legacy. For all the attempts to erase him, to silence him, to file him away as a footnote, he remains. Not just as a historical curiosity, but as a symbol of everything the monarchy wanted to ignore. His existence challenges the myth of perfection. It exposes the cruelty that can hide behind protocol. And it forces us to ask who gets remembered and who gets hidden. When we think about Prince John now, we think about a child caught between two worlds. One where he could run free, play with his toys, and laugh without fear. And another where his every movement was judged, his every imperfection treated as a threat. His story is a reminder that behind the gold-trimmed portraits and carefully worded press releases, there are people flawed, vulnerable, and often unheard. Today, if you visit the churchyard at Sandringham, you'll find his grave. Modest, clean, surrounded by others who served or were connected to the estate. It doesn't stand out, it doesn't scream royalty. But it marks the resting place of a boy who was once a prince, who lived and died in silence. But silence is no longer enough to keep the truth buried, because we remember him now. We remember Prince John not just for how he died, but for how he was forgotten. For the stolen moments, the stolen years, the stolen identity, for the train sets and bedtime stories, for the window he stared out of, waiting for someone who never came. For the simple, human need to be seen. In remembering him, we reckon with a royal past that still struggles with imperfection. We hold up a mirror to power and ask, what is it truly worth if it costs a child his life? Prince John's voice may have been taken from him, but his story continues to speak softly, steadily, insistently. And now, finally, the world is listening.